Hey everyone, welcome back to Listen. This is Latin America at the center of a new global power struggle. Before we begin, I'd like to give you a little context here. I've been living permanently in Colombia for the past 16 years, teaching English in this exact way. Not just grammar and vocabulary, but real-world English, the English of business, politics, economics, and global power. I lived in Bogota for 11 years. Now I live in Tolima. And I work with individuals and professionals and the business communities here. The ones that want to understand what is happening in the world and talk about it confidently in English. So that's a bit of background onto the episode. Today's topic couldn't be more relevant. We're talking about something big unfolding off the coast of Latin America. And most people are not paying enough attention to this. This episode is aimed at intermediate to upper intermediate level students. I'm probably going to do this at C1 level 2. Anyway, here we go. So, a huge portion of the United States naval fleet is now positioned in the Caribbean. When we say huge, we mean the largest American naval deployment in the region since the Cuban Missile Crisis. A naval deployment is just the organized movement and positioning of warships for strategic purposes. That comparison is not accidental. The Cuban Missile Crisis, which took place in 1962, that was the moment when the United States discovered that the Soviet Union was secretly installing nuclear missiles in Cuba, which is just 90 miles from Florida. This discovery triggered 13 days of extreme tension. When the world came closer to nuclear war than at any other point in modern history, the US responded with a naval blockade. A blockade means the military isolation of a country by sea, designed to stop Soviet ships from delivering more weapons. And it was a last-minute diplomatic deal that prevented catastrophe. So when analysts today say this is the largest naval buildup since that crisis, they are signaling Cold War level seriousness, not routine military activity. This is not symbolic. This is what we call raw geopolitics, meaning power politics between states, often involving military force or resources and influence. Officially, the explanation is simple. Drug interdiction. Interdiction means the act of stopping or blocking illegal activity, especially at sea. But unofficially, many observers believe something much deeper is happening here. This is where a useful phrasal verb comes in, to scratch beneath the surface. This means to look beyond the official explanation, to find the real reasons, to scratch beneath the surface. And when you scratch beneath the surface of this, three words keep appearing: oil, power, and China. At first glance, at first look, Venezuela seems like the obvious focus. But very quickly, neighboring countries begin to ask uncomfortable questions. Like, is this only about Venezuela? Could Colombia be next? Could Brazil be under pressure? Is this about elections, leaders, or something bigger? This uncertainty creates what we call a strategic dilemma. This is a dilemma, a problem, being a situation where every available option carries serious risks. Latin American governments are increasingly caught between two giants. On one side is the United States, their largest investor, meaning the country that places the most capital into their economies. On the other side is China, their largest trading partner, meaning the country they buy from and sell to the most. So Latin American governments are increasingly caught between these two giants. We say to be caught between a rock and a hard place. This is an idiom, meaning to face two equally difficult choices. This perfectly captures this situation. Latin America or Latin American governments are caught between a rock and a hard place. You see, historically, the United States has viewed Latin America as its sphere of influence. A sphere of influence means a region where one power expects political and economic dominance. This idea goes back nearly 2 centuries. It goes back to something called the Monroe Doctrine. This was something that was first announced in 1823. And the Monroe Doctrine declared that European powers should not interfere in the Americas. And at the same time, the US promised not to interfere in Europe. So at the time, and Monroe was the president at the time, James Monroe. At the time, it was presented as a protective policy, meaning to defend newly independent nations. It was designed this way. Over time, it evolved into a justification for US intervention and dominance across the region. In practice, it meant Latin America was treated as a zone of exclusive influence, where outside powers were unwelcome. When analysts talk about a renewed or a modern version of the Monroe Doctrine, they are pointing to the same underlying message. External powers, especially China, are seen as intruders in what Washington still considers its strategic backyard. This is where the China factor becomes unavoidable. China is already deeply embedded in Latin America. By embedded, we mean so integrated that removal would be extremely difficult. Chinese firms finance infrastructure, they build ports, construct highways, and they dominate mineral processing. Maybe the most sensitive area is telecommunications. Huawei plays a central role in South America's telecommunications infrastructure. Huawei builds 5G networks, fiber optic cables, and data centers across the region, often faster and much cheaper than Western competitors. Now, once these systems are installed, replacing them becomes extremely costly and disruptive. This gives China long-term technological influence. Embedding it into the digital nervous system of Latin America. Now, from Washington's perspective, this raises national security concerns, meaning fears about vulnerability and control over data flows, national security concerns. Even Argentina, one of the most openly pro-American governments in the region, they host Chinese listening facilities, installations that are used to collect signals and data. The idea that China can simply be pushed out is unrealistic. So, we need to look at what's happening inside Latin America itself. For many years, when people spoke about populism just means political movements that claim to represent the people against elites' populism. For many years, they were usually talking about the left, and that's no longer the case. Today, right-wing populism is gaining ground, is becoming more popular across the region. Built on tough rhetoric, tough speech around crime and borders and national identity. I read something recently from an analyst who summarized the region's challenges using three powerful words. They're often referred to as the 3 C's. Crime, the expansion of violence and insecurity. Corruption, the misuse of public power for private gain. And cruelty, harsh policies that prioritize punishment over social protection. He claimed that these forces are reshaping elections, alliances, and public opinion, making the whole political landscape far more volatile. Anyway, let's return to the military build-up. We're talking about tens of thousands of American sailors and Marines, aircraft carriers, submarines, destroyers, and advanced fighter jets. This is not what you deploy if your only goal is drug enforcement. So maybe they're sending a message, meaning to demonstrate intent through action, rather than words, sending a message. Just this week, one particularly dramatic moment involved special forces intercepting an oil tanker linked to sanctioned oil sales. Sanctions are official restrictions imposed to punish or pressure governments. The message was clear. We know where this oil is going, and we can stop it. And that brings us to oil. You might ask why the United States would care about Venezuelan oil when it produces so much itself. The answer is the oil quality. You see, much US production comes from shale and fracking. This produces light oil, but many refineries, especially along the Gulf Coast, they were designed to process heavy crude, which is thick, dense, and harder to refine. This heavy crude it's needed for producing diesel fuel and asphalt and industrial lubricants. Asphalt is critical for roads and airports and large-scale infrastructure projects. Only a few countries possess large reserves of heavy crude: Canada, Venezuela, and Russia. So this means that despite America's energy boom, increase, if you like, in production, it still depends structurally, meaning by design. It still depends structurally on access to heavy crude supplies. And this is why Venezuelan oil remains geopolitically significant. Maybe the most important issue of all of this is that Latin American countries don't want to choose. They don't want to be forced to choose, because this means losing what we call strategic autonomy. That's the freedom to balance relationships independently. Latin American countries want American investment, they want Chinese trade, and they want European partnerships at the same time. Unfortunately, the global system is becoming increasingly fragmented. Fragmented just means broken into competing power blocks, if you like. Old institutions are weakening. Trade agreements are coming to an end. They're eroding, we say. Policy is increasingly shaped by personal relationships rather than rules. We are now in a world where who you know matters more than what the system says. And that shift is dangerous. At the same time, here in Latin America, of course, we have deeper structural problems which continue to hold the region back. When we say structural, we mean built into the system itself. Productivity is relatively low. Weak institutions, organized crime is a problem, and obviously inequality. All these things remain unresolved. If development were the real priority, the focus would be on reform, education, infrastructure, and state capacity. Instead, Latin America is becoming a chessboard. That's just a metaphor, meaning a place where powerful actors move smaller pieces for strategic advantage. A chessboard. And that's why what is happening now matters so much. This is not just about Venezuela. It's not just about drugs, and it's not just about oil. This is about who shapes the future of Latin America and at what cost. And that's everything for today. Thank you for listening. This is Listen. I'll see you in the next episode. As I say, I am going to do a C1 version of this episode. So until next time, bye-bye for now.